So today we're uh, talking about the legitimate uses of power. Um, this is episode 4 of the Two Roads Leadership, uh, Excellence in Leadership. Uh, my special guest today is Major General Rev Jones, U.S. Air Force retired, former F-16 pilot. Well, currently, I guess you still are. You're just out of the cockpit for a while.
Yeah,
I'll let
just
him
very
introduce
non-current.
himself, as he wishes to in more detail. So, Rev, I think you and I've chatted a little bit about this subject offline. We've known each other for a few years now. So we've had this conversation a couple of times already, the different uses of power. So I just want to jump right in with both feet. You've got some interesting comments here in the comments that you sent me. So I'm looking forward to hearing those. But really what this series is for is we're talking peer-to-peer to other businessmen and businesswomen in this industry about how to set up a business, how to build a pipeline, how to do operations, how to do human resources. Um, so this week we're focused on leadership and the uses of power and the appropriate uses of power. So I'll let you jump in with both feet, introduce yourself a little bit, give us some of your thoughts on where your head is on this issue.
Yeah, thanks, JR. As you well know, I spent 31 years in the Air Force, and so I was very fortunate to be able to grow up in essentially a leadership lab. I tell people all the time, I am not a leadership expert. I feel like I have experience, but it was on the job training, and unfortunately, I didn't have the opportunity to spend a lot of time, studying the true aspects of leadership. So I always caveat the fact that I enjoy doing these conversations, but I'm by no means ever represent myself as an expert in any of these. Just a lot of scars from over the years and learning in the school of hard knocks. When you asked me to do this, JR, I was very excited about the opportunity, largely because we tend to talk a lot about leadership in different aspects. But when you get down to the fundamental, what I will consider some of the foundational constructs of the application of power within leadership, I found that too often, and we can talk about the formal and personal elements, be it coercive, reward, positional, or expert referent. But more importantly, I tend to find that people equate power and tend to look at power as being aligned with already an established leadership role.
Mm-hmm.
What I found in the organizations that I was fortunate enough to be aligned with, there's that informal leadership that, to be honest with you, often was the true grist in the mill that made things happen. And when I saw people, being able to leverage some of these elements of power to help establish not only their ability to influence the organization, but to establish themselves as really moving the ball forward at that informal leadership level. I found to be very interesting. And so, bottom line, I'm looking forward to the conversation. But I think my initial comment is that too often there's that alignment of unless I'm actually in a formal leadership position, I'm limited in that application of power, and I just haven't found that to be true.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. As a matter of fact, I'm taking a note here, make sure we bring this up throughout the conversation. And that's what it is a conversation. So you bring up two subjects that I find very interesting and I'm very passionate about. And one is the different kinds of power and when they're appropriate, when they're not, and perhaps if you have an ideal power that you'd like to discuss. And then the role of formal and informal power. So I find whenever I bring up power, especially to emerging leaders, and to some leaders and leaders of leaders, they have this reservation about using power because they've seen it abused in history, they've seen it abused in their own lives. But in my humble opinion, power in the hands of a leader is a very beautiful thing. You mentioned it very briefly in your opening comments about it's the catalyst that gets things moving. it's really the only currency we have as a leader. Is our uses of power. If you have a vision and you want that vision enacted, the only way to get it enacted is to convince people to follow you and then execute that vision. So over the years, I've been studying leadership, and like you, I was very fortunate to be a leader for many years, but also studied leadership, at the scholastic level and academic environment, written a lot about leadership, thought a lot about leadership. You and I both teach leadership. I separate leadership from tyranny. If you look at history, there's been a lot of tyrants. And I think that's what people associate with this negative connotation to power. They weren't leading, they were being tyrants. And I know that might sound like a fine academic hair, but leaders, they don't lead tyrannically. The two are just mutually exclusive. We lead through establishing a vision, communicating that vision, convincing people to come along with us, and they believe in the vision and want to enact the vision. They're not forced to do it. So I mutually exclude leadership and tyranny. The moment you become a tyrant, you've abandoned leadership. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that as well. Over to you.
It's a great delineation, and you're exactly right. At its fundamental core, leadership is the ability to influence others, and to be able to do that. I can walk into an office and have a title on somebody's door that says, CEO or a commander, but to really influence people to do the things that you're talking about, to have them follow your vision, it does take some ability to influence and to do that, and it's leveraging that power to be able to do that. You made the comment about perhaps a negative connotation. I was reading a somewhat dated survey, but I think it's still relevant. It was from the early 2000s. But in a survey, they said that 28% of the people that responded to that felt like power was misused within their organization. And so, we do know that power in and of itself can have a negative connotation if it leads to the tyrannical aspects that you're talking about. But at its fundamental core, I think the real point in this is that people have to recognize that to actually to move the ball down the field, to influence others to follow you, it's the appropriate leveraging of that power. And as you become more of a mature leader, it's understanding all the tools that are available to you. And there's times that one tool may be more appropriate than the other. Whether it is certainly in the military, there were times where, by default, we had to rely on coercive types of leverage, whether that's in our UC or our administrative actions to control activities. But what I found is that it's just like, if you're familiar with Giant's Five Voices, there's people have a natural proclivity to or a certain, the things that they're comfortable with, whatever their personal dichotomies are. But as you become more mature as a leader, it's understanding the particular environment that you're in, the actual event that you're in, and understanding what the most appropriate power to use in any given time. And I think that just grows, and it just comes with experience in leading.
Yeah, so with that said, I wanted to dive into a little bit and make more explicit. We both mentioned a couple times the different kinds of power. So I'd like to go down the list, and depending on where you read or who you read, there can be 5 or 6. I usually talk about 6 different kinds of power. Positional power, which you've mentioned a couple of times already. That's where you have the label of commanding general or CEO or managing director, perhaps. And then expert power, which, I have a PhD. So according to the George Washington University, I'm an expert in leadership development. Relationship power tends to be, I know a person that you need to know, and therefore you'll follow me for me to introduce you to that person. Reward power we find in salaries and bonuses and promotions, and even less formalistic, perhaps, spot awards or things like that that we give. Coercive power, I think that's the one that people are most have a greatest aversion to, and it entails a punishment aspect to it. Um, you and I both come from a military background with Article 15 non-judicial punishment, speeding tickets, imprisonment if you break the law and are convicted. Those are all uses of coercive power. And then a final one, and you might hear this called different things in different backgrounds. I call it referent power, and it's just a academic way of saying you follow me because you believe in my vision and you want to follow me. You're not coerced. You're not expecting reward. I don't have any relationships or expertise, perhaps, that you need or want, and it's certainly not because I'm the boss. So what are your thoughts on each of those? Position, expert, relation, reward, coercive, and referent? I know that's a mouthful.
Yeah, it is. And the one that I'll add to that, is not often in kind of the traditional list, but I think there's also an aspect of information power. Let's talk a little bit about, the position, or, what I've often also heard, referred to as kind of a legitimate, power that just comes from the seat that you happen to sit in. As I said earlier, I think too often people associate that, if I'm not in that positional, of authority, then I'm limited in the power, leverage of power that I can use. And as I said before, I firmly disagree with that. But it is something that is, that sort of conveys, an automatic response from people. When you walk in the door as a CEO, when you walk in the door as a general officer, when your title says commander, people understand that there's, authority that comes with that, and they understand that there's a certain element of power that's associated with that. And so I want to come back to that later. I don't think that is the fundamental lever that has to be pulled, but I certainly think that it drives a lot of people's perception of how much power that you might have. Some of the things that, that I found over the years is that of the ones that you've listed, and again, it's all situational dependent, but I think that there's a certain power associated with, being an expert. Mm-hmm. I think that there's a certain power associated with networking, and certainly in today's environment, there's a power associated with information. And controlling, that level of information. And those three tend to be ones that I think are perhaps more prevalent, and for lack of a better term, powerful, in terms of moving the organization in the way that you need to be. In terms of the expert, so I found it interesting. I know you're familiar with the Air Force's version of the weapons school. And that's where we take people out of their, particular tactical system that they're in, and we literally give them the equivalent, what I'll call an operational PhD, in the application of the system that they are associated with. I found it interesting, JR, when I was, so I went to weapons school when I was a mid-level captain. As I went to the weapons school, I took all of the knowledge that I had accrued to that point. I went through this 6-month immersion. At the end, they give you a patch to put on your shoulder that says you're a graduate of the weapons school. When I came back to my squadron, to be honest with you, 80% of the things that I talked about, 80% of my brief, 80% of the way that I presented an operational problem was the same as before I left. But when I walked in the door with a weapons school patch on, all of a sudden, you have an instant pedigree. There's a certain amount of credibility that's associated with that. And I think, that expert power is a huge, a huge influence in being able to establish that credibility, to have people go, that's the person I should listen to. I think in today's age, information power also is, a strong lever. And I've seen that both used wisely, and I've seen it used very inappropriately. I've seen people from a negative sense that will try to establish their power, will try to establish their overall influence by shepherding information, that will try to withhold information so that they can walk in and be the
Mm.
smartest person in the room. And I've found that to be an extremely negative impact. And while they may think that that provides them some level of power, actually the detriment to the organization far outweighs that, because when they choose what they share and when they share it, it overall becomes kind of the theory of constraints in terms of continuous process improvement. They become the limiting funnel on what the organization has available to them. The networking piece, I think, in today's environment also is huge. Not only in terms of furthering your value to an organization by the network that you establish and your ability to leverage that, but also just in terms of opening opportunities for the organization within which you reside. And so having that, that network and being able to leverage that certainly provides a significant amount of power and value to it. And I think I'll finish with, I'm sorry, I'm rambling on here a little bit.
Oh, you're doing, yeah, good.
Yeah, I find the referent power also interesting. As you said, that's where somebody just by their personality, by the combination of characteristics or charisma, that somebody that just overall comes across as being trusted and respected. And I think that in of itself brings value. If in fact that's the only thing you bring to an organization, we can talk about this later. Then that also kind of sets an organization up for failure, because somebody may think individual X is the person with the V-shaped chest and the square jaw, and every time they smile, the sun glints off their teeth, and they go, "That's the person I want to follow." But actually put in a position of leadership, if that's all they have going for them, it tends to be something that can help you, but also that can't be the only lever that you rely on. So, and then finally, I do think that the reward is a great opportunity, given now typically, as you've already alluded to, that lever of power to me is largely associated with positional power that you have for your ability to actually be able to do that. And so, that is, when we're talking about motivating people, when we're talking about trying to drive them to higher levels of performance, it's a great tool. But I also think that too often that reward piece is tied to, whether I get my bonus or whether I get stock options. The reward can be simply, the public acknowledgement of, hey, you did a great job on this, and as a result of your actions, this happened. Just that, that basic acknowledgement and reward for an activity that has been well performed is a really powerful, inspirational tool.
Yeah, you bring up several interesting points, and thanks for all those insights. I tend to think about a continuum of maturation when I think about power. And you look at it more of as a fluid. And I really like the way you phrased that, because you've given me some new insights. So when we're young in our careers, and you've heard me talk several times about the technical, cognitive, and emotional continuum of your career. So when you're early in your career, you describe yourself as that young captain learning all of those technical skills in weapons school. And then as you matured into your higher and higher positions, not necessarily rank, because a lot of our listeners don't have military backgrounds. So as they get promoted in their careers, moving more into a cognitive space of decision making, and data collection and analytics. And then at the very senior levels, more focused more on that relationship building and the emotional intelligence. But you're right, if you don't have those foundations of technical and cognitive, you can't stand on the top of that pyramid with any legitimacy. You can't reward someone, you can't punish someone enough to make them follow you if you're not technically competent, and they think you actually do care about them, and are concerned for their welfare, and have some of that expertise, have some of the information that they need. So it is a fluid relationship, the right kind of power at the right time. But I'm a firm believer in, I take a little bit different look at charisma. I know it's gotten a bad rap over the years because charismatic leaders are often the tyrants. And so there's some association in there, or they're technically incompetent and they've just accumulated power in other ways, and they're not necessarily legitimate in their power. But I really think at the end of the day, the person who inspires the most, they don't have to be that V-shaped jaw and the sun glinting off their teeth, because there's a lot of evidence to support that spectacular leaders don't have those characteristics, but they have a vision and they're incredibly driven. And so people sign on to the visions and sign up for the drive. We talk a lot about our team here, building a championship team and wanting to be a part of that championship team, not being drug along, but actually participating as a volunteer. So yeah, that was very valuable insights from you.
But let me make sure you didn't misunderstand. To follow up on that, I absolutely agree with what you said. I think people will tend to, there's a certain aspect of having a charismatic leader,
Mm-hmm.
but I absolutely agree with you. That charisma is only going to get you so far, and so there certainly are. You have to be able to have the other foundational aspects to truly be a rounded leader.
Yeah, I'll give you a story. IRS commissioner, probably 15 years ago, I won't mention the name. I was doing some research for a customer that I was working for, and we spent the entire day in this person's organization. And so they're at the apex of the IRS, a 10-year position, presidential appointee, and started at the lower end of the org chart, talking to some entry-level folks. And then as the day went on, we went further and further up the chain of command. And every level talked about this person in such high regard that I was starting to envision. I'd never met them, had never seen their picture. I started to envision what this person looked like and how they would behave. And when I finally met him at the end of the day, it was a not tall person in a sort of a misfitting suit, and one of those people that wore small spectacles that had fingerprints on them. And I was really taken aback, because the person that everyone had been describing all day was what I would call a referent leader. Magnificent. We love working for him. Great vision, great motivator. But when I walked into the room, here was this non-charismatic person who had created a sense of charisma through their vision and actions. And it's really struck home with me, even 15 years later, how powerful that aura of charisma that he had created over his years at the organization. So what I'd like to ask you next is, if you were to give advice to an up-and-coming leader about power and the different kinds of power, they might not be in the positional power. They might have to rely on the informal powers of information expert relationship. They don't really have the opportunity to reward or be coercive. How do they start creating, collecting, and using power if they don't have any of those tools available to them?
Yeah. So, I think at the perhaps lower level, I'll use myself as an example. Again, I've already alluded to the weapons school example, but without that positional authority to where you have the ability to largely do what I'll call standard rewards, where you have the ability to, when required, use coercive power. I think at those early levels, it's really establishing the value that you bring to that organization to establish, your foundation as an informal, what I tend to refer to as an informal leader. And that is, initially, that, becoming an expert, for lack of a better term, but having that ability to really understand the processes, to go beyond just an understanding at face value of what we do, but establish yourself as the person that they can go to go,
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little stuck on this. What do you think? And they
Yeah.
value that. And so, early on, I think it's establishing that expertise. What's interesting, I think, is that the further that you go, that technical expertise tends to need to be melded with that leadership expertise. You no longer, the higher you go, people don't necessarily care if you're in an engineering firm, that you are the best engineer in that organization. It's really your leadership expertise and your leadership competence, and that will help take that organization forward. But certainly initially, it's establishing that level of credibility as an expert. And then, as I said before, I think networking is also a huge piece to be able to understand how those pieces fit together. Too often, I think, I'll use myself again as an example. When I was growing up, all I really cared about was how to be the best F-16 pilot in the Air Force. I didn't really take the time to understand the enterprise level as a junior officer, understanding how do I fit into the joint organization? What are the other aspects within this behemoth that we call the Air Force? And so my view was really limited by the prism that I looked through, which was an individual aspect. And so having that network, to be able to understand the rest of the organization, who can help me with this problem? If we're struggling, is somebody else struggling, so that I can try to figure out, how do we help each other? Who can I benchmark off of? How do I find different ways to increase my awareness of the issues that we're dealing with? And so I think, like I say, that technical, being an expert in the process, establishing your credibility, building a network that enables you to leverage beyond what your individual limitations might hold you back to. And then I still come back to this, power of information sharing, to be able to make sure that, the standard question that I tell people is, at the end of every meeting, it needs to be, okay, so who else needs to know this? So that we're getting those, that information across and accelerating the organization in parallel.
Yeah, and I do agree with you on your comments about hoarding power, or hoarding information, sorry, to retain informational power. If you follow any one of these types of power too far, they're going to fall apart. Position power, you can only get away with saying, I'm the boss, that's why, so many times. And really, probably your first 100 days in the chair, people will say, okay, you're the new CEO. Yeah, I'll listen to you. But that lasts for 100 days or less. Expert power, information power, people, you hear stories of hoarding both of those because they're afraid to dissipate their power. But really, by giving away, they grow their other kinds of power, their relationship power. And reward and coercive, I really look down on it. I tell you, as being a CEO for 15 years and now a chairman, that's probably one of the hardest, when's the carrot and when's the stick, decisions of a leader. They both have their place. I know I would drive faster if they didn't get more speeding tickets. So coercive power works on me in that regard. I love cruise control. I set it and just forget it. But you can only give somebody so many Oreo cookies, or you can only give them so many speeding tickets until it's lost its effect. So for me, and you might think about, I don't want to get too academic, but Maslow's hierarchy, and as you climb from, this, do I have a safe place to sleep, and do I have food, to this empowerment and fulfillment, and then self-actualization at the top. In some regards, in my mind's eye, the referent power is that self-actualization of leadership. That I have a team that, yeah, they want to get paid, and no, they don't want to be punished, but at the end of the day, they follow us. They believe in our vision. They believe in our core values. They believe in our mission. That, for me, is the self-actualization of leadership. Pass it back to you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree. Yeah, and no, I mean, I couldn't agree more. So, by definition, that referent power means that you're trusted, you're respected as a leader, and so you've established that foundation. Whether it's a combination of all the other things that we've talked about that get you to that point, and I
Hmm.
think it's actually a great analogy to put it in terms of the hierarchy and self-actualization. When you get to that point, you've proven yourself to where people do trust you, they do respect you, and then it certainly does add value. I also couldn't agree more in terms of the, how far do you go in terms of any one lever, whether it be positional. So we're talking about business. Any one of us that has kids, as a parent, the response to how come I have to do that, and your standard parent response is because I told you so, only get you going so far. And so it's in all aspects of life, not just this. And so I think that's, I agree with you in the way that you've addressed that, and I absolutely like the concept of a hierarchy and establishing that referent level of power that people now understand who you are, and you've established that foundation to where and when you get there, that coercive piece is less and less necessary. Now people want to follow you; they
Yeah.
want to align to your goals and your visions.
Yeah. And before we move off of this, I think um in my research and experience that over time, you move away from some kinds of power and towards others, and not just in pursuit of referent power, but when you're the young technical captain and you want to be that uh, major general, you talked about you had to start learning about the enterprise. Um, and in some regards, to spend the time doing that, you probably spent less time in the cockpit, less time studying the airplane components and systems, and more time studying the enterprise. So, a lot of our emerging leaders and leaders who are growing up in the ranks um, might struggle with leaving some of that behind. And I think it's just a natural, it, well, for one part, it goes back to our analogy of the two roads leadership, right? You're standing at a fork in the road and asking yourself, as you were as a young captain or a young major, do I want to be an enterprise leader? Or do I want to be the best F-16 pilot that it was ever born? And you're almost having to decide, do I want to learn the enterprise piece or stay in the cockpit? And that's a tough, tough decision. And, it's not by irony that that's the name of our leadership is we're constantly standing at those two roads and asking ourselves, which is the best one for us, for our family, and for our organization? What are your thoughts on that as you were a young, up and coming officer?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that in any organization, you're going to find people that are comfortable doing what they're doing. They do it well, and to be honest with you, we couldn't do it without them.
Yeah.
So not everybody is going to have that aspiration to take that road less traveled, to take a different path, to open themselves up to opportunity. In some cases, they may perceive it as risk of taking
Mm.
that other path. So I think the first question is one that's a deeply internal question. What do I want to do?
Hmm.
And I found that there are people that, to be very frank with you, are uncomfortable. They don't want to take the mantle of leadership on for whatever reason, whether it's the perceived time commitment, whether it's the additional responsibilities, whatever it might be. They're very comfortable doing what they're doing, and they're good at it.
Hmm.
So the essence of your question is, as you're standing at the road, at that fork in the road, that's a deeply personal, introspective question as to what do I want to do. But when you're at that road, I think it's that is where you have to make that fundamental decision. Do I keep doing what I have been doing? It may have served me well to this point, but there's an acknowledgement that it may only get me so far.
Yeah.
And if in fact you're interested in wanting to have new opportunities to take on different challenges, there has to be that kind of shift in mindset that says, now I've got to open myself up, which can be scary. I've got to open myself up to things that I've not done before. I've got to study things that I've not done before.
Hmm.
I've got to put myself out there and take some risk. And to be honest with you, I certainly have had plenty of failures along that, where I stumbled and fell and had to get up and dust myself off. But
Yeah.
it's that willingness to take on those additional risks and challenges that'll actually move you forward.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear you mention the word risk, because the world tends to reward risk. And I don't mean foolhardy risk, but if you are standing at that road and one of them is relatively safe, one of them does require a bit of risk, the one that requires a little bit of risk is probably going to return the greater reward. But fully recognizing, back to your thoughts about, yeah, we need some technical, deep technical expertise. And bring it back to a business perspective. We do need people that love coding and all they want to do is code all their life. In a law enforcement environment, all they want to do is be a street cop and do that. And good on them. We need them. One of those forks in the road we ask ourselves is, am I willing and able? So you might have the ability to grow up in the ranks, but you just don't feel that it's best for your life. Or like when we were both second lieutenants, we were full of willingness, but we didn't have a whole lot of capability. And that came over time through experience, through education, through training, through drive. So yeah, it is deeply personal. I tell everybody in our classrooms and in our coaching that you better bring in your significant others in these decisions, because when you're standing at those forks in the road, you decide to go down one of them and they haven't had a contribution to that conversation, you might find yourself going down it alone. I know you and I have both been married for a number of years and have significant others in our lives. You have 5 children, I have 4 children. All of them in these decisions, because it's a journey.
It is, and it can be a wild ride.
Yeah.
And I am glad that you brought up, this, for those of us that are fortunate to have, spouses or significant others that, that we can rely on going through. Certainly, Heidi, my wife, was a partner in every one of those decisions, and she also helped me through. And like I said, I stumbled a couple of times and I tripped a couple of times, and there were days. I can vividly remember JR rolling over in bed and tapping my wife on the shoulder and say, "Hey, tomorrow, remind me I'm having fun," because right now I've got the weight of the world on my shoulders. But it does. It needs to be a collective decision, and that will help, I think, in the reinforcement of the commitment that it takes. I mean, I'm not implying that to move yourself up the chain is a gargantuan task, but it does take a commitment. It does take, and it's not just a commitment and effort. Too often I've seen people that are concerned about the assuming higher mantles of responsibility with any company or any organization, and what they tend to fall back on is the time associated with that. So it's not just a commitment of effort. It's a commitment to learn things. It's a commitment to go outside of your factor. It's a commitment to, if I had progressed up the ranks in the Air Force, knowing nothing else than I knew as a second lieutenant, and granted, I thought as a second lieutenant I knew everything, but I was woefully ill-informed. So there's just no way to progress up and still have that mindset, still have that reference point that you have when you started in the organization. So it takes that commitment to go beyond just what you're doing every day, and to really take the effort, not just in time, but mostly in a commitment of expanding your horizons and learning the things that will make you more valuable at higher levels.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for those insights. So one of the things I asked you as you were getting ready to come on today was bring in a positive example of leadership in the topic of power. So you had here one of your group commanders. Without giving away too many details, can you tell us that story?
Yeah. So I was in an organization where one of my subordinate commanders just really wasn't working out well. And it gets back to that hoarding of information and trying to make sure that he was the only one that I could talk to get what I needed to learn. And it didn't bode well, and our organization suffered for it. I took the time to do some research on who I wanted to bring in behind this person. And back to your point of a charismatic leader, but also somebody that had the technical expertise. It took me a little bit of time, but I found the person that I felt was the right one to bring into the organization. And JR, this organization was on a downward slide, like you read about. But we brought in somebody. I had a history with him. I knew him, so there was a certain amount of trust in bringing him in. But as sharp as that decline was in terms of the overall health of the organization, when we brought somebody in that had an understanding of how an organization needs to work, more importantly, how to lead, how to use these elements of power, as sharp as that decline was, it was even sharper in the recovery process. And so it showed me that when you have somebody that is a mature leader, that understands, what's the right voice to use at the right time. And again, I'm not talking about our spoken voice, but back to,
right.
Your personality, and when to use the appropriate levers of power. It was fascinating to watch, and from my perspective, I was very grateful to see how you can and how much a difference an individual can make in an organization's overall health. And so, like I said, he turned that organization around in a matter of months, and they ended up being one of the strongest organizations within my whole command.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I think back to just last week. You and I had the great fortune to spend an entire 7 days with a room full of very senior leaders from one of our customer organizations. And the number two person in the organization spent the entire 7 days with us. And that speaks so loudly about not only the referent power this very senior person was demonstrating, because to a person, everyone in the room um, apparently would have followed this person anywhere. But to spend 7 full days, to include a Saturday and a Sunday, away from his family for no reason other than to strengthen the leadership of everyone else in the room, I think speaks so directly to our topic today of power, and a very good use of power, a very non-tyrannical use of power. No hint of coercive power in the room. Maybe a hint or two of reward power of what their futures might look like. Some position power, but very little at that level, not necessary. A lot of information power, a lot of expert power, but certainly a magnitude of relationship power. You know who I'm talking about. I don't want to throw the person's name out there or the agency out there, but any thoughts on his use of power last week?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I thought that was a great example. And the other piece that I'll offer to that is, as you said, the referent power was obvious. What I also enjoyed seeing was with the people that were present in that, their recognized power in terms of expertise, in terms of their individual power that they brought to the organization. And that individual that we're referring to had established a culture to where people felt free to express their opinion. And for everything that you said, I absolutely agree with. What I'll amplify that with is I thought it was great to watch this leading individual during conversations of very difficult problems and challenges that organization has to deal with. As people spoke, that individual, the leader that was in the room, was taking notes, was really absorbing that information, and will continue to use that. So it was a good example to me of that trust, having that ability to leverage the expertise within your organization, establishing that culture that enables that very frank level of feedback. but there was no aversion, to going, that's a great idea, and writing it down and using that to take that organization forward. It was a great example.
Hmm. So another question that I asked you about, thanks for that. Another question I asked you about was, what are you reading lately? Any recommendations for our listeners about advice, information that they might dive into?
Yeah, I'm embarrassed to tell you that I'm not reading a book right now, that's particularly focused on leadership, and I probably should. But I just finished a book that I found, had some great examples of the things that we're talking about. Um, it's a book by an individual named Annie Jacobson. The title of the book is Surprise, Kill, Vanish, but it's talking about covert operations and how they have evolved over the years. And the only point that I think is relevant for this conversation is that it's filled with examples where we've talked about, whether it's referent power or, expertise, but it was, one individual element that as this capability was burgeoning, they put this individual in charge of very challenging, very difficult, um, demanding processes. And it's replete with examples. While there's certainly examples of success, it's replete with examples where people were based on an individual element, whether it was perceived expertise in some other capacity, that in the urgency of the situation, they went, "That's our guy, that's our gal," and it's replete with examples where we've talked a lot about you can't rely on any one element of power. And it gave me some good things to think about of over reliance on one task or one element that can really drive drastic failures without having a full understanding of how to actually use the different levers that are available to you for success.
Oh, thanks. Surprise, Kill, Vanish. Very interesting name.
Yeah.
Relevant outside of being the surpriser, the killer, or the vanisher, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So for me, the quote that keeps coming to mind whenever I talk about power is that power abhors a vacuum and will always be filled by something. And it can either be filled by your leadership power or it can be filled by tyrannical power. So whenever I think about am I willing and able to be a leader, the reason I always raise my hand or step forward is I want that void to be filled with leadership and not tyranny. And it takes you back to the Edmund Burke quote about the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. Um, we've seen that in history. We see it in our own lives. And it's the thing that keeps me creating, collecting, and using power as a leader. Um, so as we wrap up, any closing thoughts to leave our listeners with?
Just overall, JR, I appreciate the opportunity as always to talk with you. And I do think this, as I started at the beginning of this conversation, it's a great topic to talk about. And I guess my closing thought is that, as people understand how to leverage these instruments of power, don't wait until the time that your name is on the front door as the leader of the organization. You have the ability to leverage these particular levers or elements of power to make not only you more successful, but more importantly, to make your organization more successful. So it's a great topic. Thanks for inviting me to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Last thing, you had this phrase here, earning your leadership rights every day. What's in your head when you write that down?
So, as I went up in rank, I always expected that I would be given the foundational element of respect for the rank that I wore or the position that you have in the company, whether it's the CEO or the COO or the CFO as an executive. I think that conveys a foundational level of authority and hopefully, respecting the organization. For me, though, my goal was to earn that leadership responsibility every day. I couldn't rely just on the fact that my door, had a commander title on it. I took it as a personal responsibility to earn the right to lead, which is a privilege, not a right. But to earn that privilege each and every day. So it takes a daily commitment, no matter how bad your day is going, no matter what problems you're dealing with. You have to focus on the health of the organization, and you have to earn that right, earn that privilege to lead every day.
Well, great. It's been wonderful having you here, and thanks for your graciousness and giving us your decades of leadership experience. It's not often we get to talk to a major general or someone who's got the flying experience that you have. So we're very thankful of that. And so proud to have you on the team here, and look forward to chatting with you again soon. Have
Absolutely.
a great
Thanks again
day.
for the invitation. You too.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.